I'm Lauren Bennett, 34 years old, and I can still feel the sharp quiet in my mother's kitchen the night she told me not to outshine my sister. Paige's laugh drifted from the living room while I stood by the stove holding a scholarship letter. I tried to share my news, but my mother barely looked up from her crossword. Paige walked in with a plate of cookies. Mom beamed and said, "You were always my lucky star." I stood there holding my envelope. My father turned the page of his newspaper, and that's when I realized I was always going to be the afterthought in this house. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments. And if you've ever felt invisible in your own family, hit that like and subscribe button for more stories that understand. I grew up in a small town just outside Dayton, Ohio. In a white house with green shutters and a driveway lined with peonies, my parents believed in keeping up appearances every Saturday morning. My mother swept the porch and waved at neighbors with a practiced smile. My father was the kind of man who fixed fence posts and taught us to rake the leaves, just so I was the quiet one with hair always pulled back. Books piled on my nightstand, and a fascination with computers that started when I was 10. My mother wanted daughters who belonged in the yearbook, the kind who won homecoming or smiled for family photos. Paige fit her mold from the start. All sunshine and confidence, she was a cheerleader, a runner-up for Miss Montgomery County, always surrounded by friends when Paige landed her first job at a boutique downtown. Mom framed the business card and hung it by the fridge. I was different. I coded my first website in 8th grade and spent summers volunteering at the library while Paige went to parties. My walls filled up with math awards, science ribbons, and printouts of scholarship emails. But whenever I tried to share my news, my mother would nod and change the subject. She always said computers are nice, but a good husband matters more. Dad would come in late from work, set down his lunchbox, and tell me not to let it get to me. But he never stepped in when Mom started her comparisons. He just kept the peace when I was accepted to Georgia Tech, my mother said. Don't forget where you came from. Paige was starting a new job at a salon that week, and there was a family dinner in her honor. I went to campus with 2 suitcases and a savings account full of babysitting money. College opened up a world I hadn't known was possible. I met Dana. My first week when we reached for the same coffee mug in the student union, she grinned and said, "Looks like we're both running on caffeine and curiosity." I'd never met anyone like her. She let me talk about algorithms and never told me to be quiet. I went home for breaks out of habit, but every time I returned, the gap between my 2 lives grew wider. Paige would talk about her new apartment or her boyfriend. Mom would pass me the green beans and ask if I'd met any nice men at school, if I tried to talk about my research or an internship. She'd smile and say, "Lauren, don't bore everyone with the tech talk." It was the fall of my last year at Georgia Tech when I met Colin. He was giving a talk at the campus business incubator, and afterward he asked me what I thought of his startup's website. I pointed out a flaw in his code and he laughed, said I was the first person who'd noticed we started meeting for coffee and talking late into the night. Colin listened when I spoke, asked questions, and remembered details that mattered. He made me feel seen for the first time by spring. He asked to visit my family for Easter. I thought maybe this time things would be different. Maybe if they saw the man who loved me, they'd finally understand. I didn't know that bringing him home would be the start of everything unraveling. Colin and I drove out to my parents' house that spring, the trunk packed with a pie I'd baked and a bottle of red wine he'd picked up on the way. The air outside was crisp, and the cherry trees lining the street were just starting to bloom. My father met us at the door with a smile that was almost shy. My mother, as always, was ready for guests, wearing her favorite blue cardigan and pearls. She ushered us into the living room, offering Colin coffee and setting a plate of cookies on the table, as if he'd been part of the family for years. The conversation at dinner started light. Colin spoke about his business, his time at Stanford, and his ideas for helping small companies reach new customers. My father leaned in, interested. My mother kept pouring Colin more wine and asking about his travel schedule. "You've really made something of yourself," she said, her voice polite but sharp around the edges. Halfway through the meal, Paige arrived late as always, in a dress that caught the light and heels that clicked against the kitchen tile. She floated into the room all smiles and bright greetings and wrapped Mom in a quick hug before turning to Colin. "So this is the guy Lauren's been hiding," she said, resting a hand on his arm and laughing, as if they shared a private joke. From then on, Paige drew Colin into every topic. When he mentioned hiking, she insisted she loved the outdoors. If he brought up sushi, she said she had a favorite spot, even though she'd always ordered chicken teriyaki growing up. Every time I tried to add something, my mother gently redirected the conversation. "Lauren, can you help me with the coffee?" she asked, pulling me away, just as I tried to share my internship news. Back in the kitchen, Mom turned on the faucet and whispered, "Paige needs a good match, honey. She's been unlucky lately." She handed me a stack of plates and told me to let Paige and Colin get to know each other. I stood at the sink listening to their voices drift in from the dining room, feeling a kind of chill settle in my chest. Colin stayed gracious the whole evening. After dessert, he offered to help my father with the recycling, then thanked my mother for dinner before we left. On the drive back to Atlanta, he squeezed my hand and said, "Your family's got a lot of spirit." I looked out the window watching the lights slip by. I didn't say much. Over the next few weeks, things with Colin grew uncertain. He started answering texts late, then not at all some days. Our Friday night dinners became phone calls, then short messages, then silence. He always said he was busy with investors or traveling, and I believed him. But something felt different. One night I opened my laptop to check my email and saw a picture on social media from a restaurant in my hometown. The photo showed a group at a back table, and Colin was there in the corner smiling. He had told me he was in Charlotte that weekend, but here he was in Dayton. The next day I called and asked him about it. He hesitated, then said he'd been meeting someone about a new project and ran into my mother at the grocery store. She'd insisted he stop by for coffee, he said. I wanted to believe him, so I told myself it was nothing. 3 weeks later, when I couldn't stand the silence, I decided to surprise him. I drove straight to his apartment, but his roommate said he'd left town for a few days visiting family. I knew his family lived in Oregon, not Ohio. My hands shook on the steering wheel as I drove out to my parents' house without calling first. It was late by the time I arrived. The house was dark except for a single lamp glowing in the living room. I let myself in and heard voices, my mother's, Paige's, and Colin's, soft but clear from the next room. I stood in the hallway and listened. Mom was saying, "You and Paige have so much in common. Lauren's always off in her own world, but Paige understands people." I heard Colin reply that things had been complicated lately. Paige's voice slipped in light and easy. "Lauren never really cared for these family things, did she?" Mom said. "Paige would make a wonderful partner for someone like you, Colin. She has all the right connections." I walked in then. The sound of my shoes startling everyone. Colin stood up too fast, nearly knocking over his glass. My mother straightened her skirt. Paige pressed her lips together and looked at the floor. No one spoke first, so I did. I asked how long this had been going on. Colin said it wasn't what it looked like, but his words sounded hollow. My mother insisted they'd just been talking that Colin was lonely, and Paige had been spending more time at home lately. Paige said she just happened to stop by, but her voice trembled. I asked Colin directly when these visits had started. He looked away and admitted my mother had called him to check in, said my father was under the weather and could use the company. I knew my father had been fine all month. I turned to my mother and asked why. She said, "Let's be practical, Lauren. Paige needs stability. You have your work, your degrees, your independence. Paige needs a partner who can provide for her." She said it softly, but each word felt final. Colin stood there, unable to meet my eyes. "Your family helped me realize maybe we want different things. You're always working. Maybe you'd be happier apart." His voice trailed off. I didn't wait for Paige or my mother to explain. I walked out the door keys clenched in my hand and drove until the streetlights faded behind me. When I couldn't drive any further, I pulled into an empty parking lot and called Dana. My voice shook as I told her everything. She said to come stay with her for as long as I needed. That night, sitting on her old sofa, I realized how quickly something you thought was solid could disappear. The ache in my chest was a cold, hard thing, but I still had one friend who opened her door without asking questions. That would have to be enough for now. I moved into Dana's apartment with just a duffel bag, a stack of textbooks, and the quiet ache of losing both Colin and my family in a single night. Dana cleared off her old pull-out couch for me and made sure there was always tea and soup in the kitchen. But the days blurred together. I slept for hours at a time and then lay awake through the night, staring at the ceiling, replaying every word from that awful evening. Sometimes Dana would sit with me and tell funny stories about her aunts and her childhood in Minnesota, hoping to pull me back into the present. But it was like my mind had gone somewhere I couldn't reach. I tried to go back to class, but I couldn't focus. Every hallway on campus reminded me of afternoons with Colin. Every library table was a memory I didn't want to touch. I opened my laptop to work on my final project and just stared at the screen, unable to type a single line. One morning, I got an email from my advisor asking if I was all right. I never replied. By the end of that week, I knew I couldn't finish the semester. The thought of attending graduation, sitting in a room full of strangers, felt impossible. I went to the academic office and withdrew with just 6 weeks left before I would have earned my degree. The secretary glanced at my file and said, "Are you sure, Lauren? You're one of our strongest students?" I nodded and kept my eyes on the desk until the paperwork was done. The world outside seemed quieter after that. I stopped checking my phone. Paige sent a few texts at first asking if I was coming home for Easter brunch. My mother sent links to job openings for Paige in the family group chat, pretending nothing had happened. Colin tried to call. I let it ring over and over until his number disappeared from my screen. I took long walks around Dana's neighborhood, sometimes ending up blocks away with no idea how I'd gotten there. Sometimes I sat by the river watching the water move. Dana offered to walk with me, but I usually said no. I wanted the silence. Dana finally convinced me to try therapy. She gave me a list of counselors she found online, and I picked one almost at random. The therapist, Dr. Whitaker, had a gentle voice and a way of listening that didn't rush me. She never acted shocked or surprised when I described the things my mother had said or how invisible I felt growing up. She told me it was okay to be angry. She said that my hurt was real, and it was all right to grieve the family I thought I had. I went to therapy every Thursday. I started talking about things I'd never said out loud, about how my mother never let me forget I wasn't enough, and how my father tried to smooth things over, but never really saw me. Dr. Whitaker helped me see that I didn't have to keep chasing approval that was never going to come. She said, "You get to decide who belongs in your life now." It took a while for that to sink in. As summer came, I applied to finish my degree at the University of Washington. It was as far from Dayton as I could imagine, and still felt like home. I mailed in my transcripts, wrote a brief letter explaining my withdrawal, and waited. When the acceptance email finally came, Dana hugged me so tightly I could hardly breathe. "You're going to love Seattle," she said. "Fresh air, good coffee, and no one who remembers anything about your past." I packed my things in 2 suitcases and bought a one-way plane ticket. Dana drove me to the airport, her car filled with snacks and goodbye notes from her cousins. At the gate, she made me promise to call her every Sunday and not to delete her number no matter what. She waved until I couldn't see her anymore. Seattle felt like a reset. My apartment was tiny, just a studio with one big window facing a line of evergreen trees. I hung up new curtains, bought a thrift store table, and kept the place as empty as I could. I started classes and met classmates who didn't know anything about my family or Colin or the heartbreak I'd carried from Ohio. For the first time, I could just be Lauren. No one cared who Paige was or how many ribbons she'd won. At first, I kept my head down and my voice quiet. I focused on my work and went to class, then came home and made simple dinners. My classmates were kind, but never pried. There was a woman in my software design class named Maya who invited me to join her study group. There was Marcus, a neighbor in the building, who offered to fix my leaky faucet one rainy night. I started to say yes to small things, a study session, a walk by the lake, a cup of tea in the lobby. The loneliness didn't disappear overnight, but it faded a little with each passing week. I still thought about my family, sometimes opening my email late at night just to see if my father had sent anything. He hadn't. My mother posted family photos online, Paige at brunch page and Mom at the farmer's market, but I stopped looking after a while. Every now and then I'd get a group message about some new milestone in Paige's life, but I never replied. I worked hard in my classes. My advisor in Seattle was supportive, encouraging me to take on projects that challenged me. The faculty didn't know anything about my history. When I finished my degree, I graduated quietly. Dana sent flowers, and Maya brought me cupcakes. There was no family in the audience, but there was a sense of relief that felt almost like pride. I found a job at a small tech company downtown. The pay wasn't much, but it was enough to cover rent and groceries. The office was bright, filled with people who cared about doing good work. I learned to speak up in meetings, and after a few months, I started mentoring interns. I met new friends Kim, who loved to hike and dragged me up Mount Rainier even when it rained. David and Aaron, who lived down the hall and made sure I never spent holidays alone. Through all of it, I kept seeing Dr. Whitaker now by video chat. We talked about boundaries, about learning to trust the new people in my life, and about letting go of the idea that I could have changed my mother or saved my relationship with Paige. She reminded me that healing wasn't a straight line. One night after a long week at work, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea and realized I hadn't thought about Colin or my family all day. The silence in my apartment was peaceful, not empty. I looked out the window at the city lights and felt for the first time in a long while like I was finally starting to find my way again. The next morning, I woke to a message from my father. It was short, just a few lines asking how I was and if I might want to talk sometime. I stared at the screen, unsure how to answer. But instead of panic, I felt something almost like hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, things could change. The message from my father sat on my phone all morning. I kept glancing at it between sips of coffee and the gentle hum of Seattle's rain against the window. I thought about what I would say if I would say anything at all. Eventually, I typed out a simple reply. "I'm doing all right, Dad. Hope you are too." I hit send, my hands shaking, then left the apartment to clear my head. I walked through the city for hours past food trucks and bookshops through Pike Place Market, where the smell of fresh bread always drifted on the air. I bought a bouquet of tulips, not for anyone, just for the splash of color on my kitchen table. That afternoon, as I sat beside the window, I felt a shift, something lighter, as if the clouds were thinning just a bit. Classes moved quickly, and for the first time in years, I threw myself into my work for the joy of it. I studied late into the night, pushing myself sometimes just to see how far I could go. I picked up a part-time job at a tech support desk. The pay was barely enough to cover groceries, but it gave me structure. There was a quiet pride in making my own way, even when my bank account was nearly empty by the end of each month. Maya from my software design class invited me out with her friends. I went at first nervous, then surprised to find myself laughing at stories that had nothing to do with my past. I told them I was from Ohio, that I liked mountain air and long walks. No one asked why I'd left home. They only asked if I wanted to join them for trivia night or hiking in the Cascades. Kim called most weekends, never taking no for an answer when it came to fresh air and exercise. We hiked trails along the Sound and talked about everything from bad first dates to family quirks. She never pressed for details about mine. She just kept showing up, and that mattered. Work at the tech firm grew busier as I found my footing. My supervisor, a woman named Ruth, noticed my persistence and careful attention to detail. She asked me to take the lead on a small project redesigning a user interface for a healthcare client. I poured everything into it, staying late some nights, learning as I went. When the client sent a thank you note, Ruth handed it to me and said, "You have real talent, Lauren. Don't be afraid to step forward." The words surprised me. No one in my family had ever told me to take the lead. I carried that note in my bag for weeks, reading it on hard days. One evening after class, Maya suggested we try a new cafe near campus. As we settled at a small table by the window, she shared stories about growing up in Portland and her father's obsession with crossword puzzles. The conversation drifted to hopes and plans for the future. When she asked if I missed Ohio, I hesitated. I told her I missed the seasons sometimes and the sound of cardinals in the morning, but not much else. She nodded, understanding more than I expected. "You can start over, you know. I did when I moved here." Her words felt like an invitation. That night, I sat in my apartment thinking about what starting over might mean. I made a list of things I wanted, small, simple things. Finish my degree. Find a job where my voice mattered. Surround myself with people who saw me for who I was, not who they expected me to be. On weekends, I walked to the community garden near my apartment. The city felt new every time I noticed something I'd missed before: a mural, a stray cat, the sound of music from an open window. The loneliness was still there, but it didn't weigh as much. I was building a life one quiet moment at a time. My father's messages became more frequent, always short and cautious. Hope Seattle is treating you well. Your mom is busy with the neighborhood association. Paige is between jobs again. Sometimes he asked if I'd come home for Thanksgiving or Christmas. I always said no, but thanked him for inviting me. He never pushed, just sent a smiley face or a line about the weather. I didn't hear much from my mother. Once in a while, she'd send a group email about family news, but there were no direct calls, no apology, no mention of what happened. Paige sent a birthday message one year, just a quick, "Hope you're doing great." I answered with a simple thanks. Classes and work filled my days, but there were still nights when old pain crept in. Dr. Whitaker reminded me to be gentle with myself, that healing was not a race. I spent those evenings curled up with a book, or calling Dana, who would always find a way to make me laugh. Sometimes we'd talk about our old dreams, her idea of opening a bookstore, my wish to build software that helped people. One evening in late autumn, I got a call from Ruth. She offered me a full-time position at the company after graduation, with a salary that felt like a windfall. I called Dana first, then Maya and Kim, letting the good news fill the apartment like warm light. That winter I watched the snow fall outside my window. I let myself think about the future, not with fear, but with a kind of cautious hope. There were still bruises, still echoes of what I'd lost, but I was stronger now. I saw it in the way I walked into meetings, the way I spoke up in class, and the way I answered my father's messages with kindness, but no longer with longing. As the days grew longer, I realized I was starting to build something I'd never had before, a sense of home not tied to a place or a family name, but to the life I was making for myself. For the first time, I wasn't looking back. My first real paycheck from the tech firm felt almost unreal. I bought groceries without checking the price on every carton of eggs and treated myself to a sturdy pair of rain boots that didn't leak on my walk to work. Little by little, I settled into a routine. Most evenings I cooked simple dinners and called Dana or Kim just to hear a friendly voice. I still kept Dr. Whitaker's number pinned to my bulletin board, a reminder that if things got rough, I didn't have to go it alone. Work kept me busy. I liked being the person who could figure out a tough coding bug or make a process run smoother. Ruth kept giving me more responsibility, and each time I took on something new, I felt the old worries. What if I failed? What if I disappointed someone begin to loosen their hold? There were tough days, sure, but there were good ones too, when the team went out for burgers, or Ruth stopped by my desk just to say, "Nice work, Lauren." The apartment started to feel less like a stopgap and more like a home. I hung a thrifted painting of wildflowers in the entryway and bought a secondhand bookshelf for my growing stack of library finds. Maya and I met for coffee every couple of weeks, swapping stories about work and trying to one-up each other with bad date tales. Sometimes I still wondered about Paige, about my father, even about my mother, but I let those thoughts float by without chasing them down. Spring brought cherry blossoms and a sense that something new was possible. I signed up for a rock climbing class with Kim and only made it halfway up the beginner's wall before my arms gave out, but I laughed harder than I had in months. Afterward, we walked by the lake as the sun set, and Kim asked if I ever thought about dating again. Maybe I said, but not yet. A few weeks later, Ruth put me on a new project, a partnership with a hospital that was looking to upgrade its entire data security system. She introduced me to the hospital's consulting architect, Eric Lynn, who was brought in from San Francisco for the job. Eric was quiet with a dry sense of humor and a way of looking at a problem from every angle before speaking. We spent long hours reviewing code and mapping out solutions. Sometimes we'd work straight through dinner, only realizing how late it was when the office lights dimmed around us. Eric never asked about my past. We talked about books, city parks, favorite foods. He listened when I spoke and remembered what I liked. Strong tea oatmeal cookies, old mystery novels. When the project went live and everything worked better than expected, Eric sent me a note. "Couldn't have done this without you. Let's celebrate." We met for Thai food at a tiny spot he'd found in the International District. For the first time in a long time, I let myself relax around someone new. One Saturday, Kim hosted a potluck for her birthday. She told me to bring anything with cheese and not to worry about showing up alone. I arrived with a casserole and found Maya, David, and Aaron already there, Eric helping Kim string lights in the backyard. The group felt easy, like a chosen family. We ate, played cards, and shared stories until it got dark. Eric stayed close but never crowded me. At the end of the night, as we stood by the door, he asked if I wanted to go hiking the next weekend. I said yes. The trail was muddy and the air crisp, Mount Rainier rising in the distance. Eric and I walked in comfortable silence, sometimes sharing stories, sometimes just listening to the birds. At the summit, we sat on a flat rock and shared a thermos of hot coffee. Eric asked about my family, careful and gentle. I told him a little enough for him to know there was distance, but not the whole story. He nodded and didn't push. Days blurred into weeks. We hiked, tried new restaurants, swapped favorite playlists. I noticed I was starting to look forward to his texts, his dry jokes, the way he noticed small things others missed. I caught myself smiling more at work. When Eric asked if I wanted to go to the jazz festival downtown, I realized I was ready to let someone new in, just a little at a time. One rainy night after a late shift, I got a call from my father. His voice was softer than I remembered, hesitant. He said he missed me. He said he wished things had been different and that he was sorry. I listened, unsure what to say, but I heard something in his words, a kind of regret that felt real. I told him about my new job, the friends I'd made, even about Eric. He asked if we could talk again soon. For the first time, I thought maybe we could. That winter, I realized I'd come further than I ever expected. The pain from my family's betrayal was still there, but it wasn't the only thing in my life. I was working, building friendships, and slowly learning to trust again. The world felt larger, filled with possibility. Eric and I walked through the city one cold night, stopping to look at the lights strung up in the trees along the park. He took my hand, quiet and sure. I didn't pull away. As spring crept back in, I saw how much had changed. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was growing. I was building something new, and this time it was all mine. Spring in Seattle brought new rhythms, long walks after work weekends, exploring little coffee shops with Eric, and evenings filled with laughter from Kim's living room. My days were full, and for a while the past stayed at a safe distance. Then one Monday morning, I woke to a message from my father. "Your mother and I would like to visit," he wrote. "We want to see how you're doing. Paige and Colin will come too. Let us know if that's all right." I stared at the screen, heart-pounding memories flooding back. I set the phone down and took a slow breath. It had been nearly 3 years since I'd seen any of them face to face. I told Kim first. She was quiet, waiting for me to finish. "You don't have to let them in if you're not ready," she said. But I was ready. Or maybe I needed to know that I could survive it. I replied to my father, "Yes, let me know when you'll arrive." The weeks leading up to their visit felt like preparing for a storm. I cleaned the apartment, bought fresh flowers, and set extra towels on the bed in the guest room. Eric offered to stay with friends for the weekend, but I wanted him there. "They should see the life I've built," I told him, my voice steady. The day they arrived, the sky was gray and drizzling, typical for April. I waited by the window as a rental car pulled up outside. My father stepped out first, thinner than I remembered, but he smiled when he saw me. My mother followed, her hair perfectly styled, lips pressed tight. Paige was last, carrying 2 suitcases and a look I couldn't read. Colin lagged behind, hands in his pockets. I opened the door and stepped back, letting them enter. My mother glanced around, taking in every detail of the apartment, the polished wood floors, the sunlight filtering through the curtains, the shelf lined with books and potted plants. She offered a compliment, carefully worded. "You've done well for yourself, Lauren." My father gave me a brief, uncertain hug. Paige put down her bags and looked around. "It's nice, Laure. You did all this on your own." There was no malice in her voice, only surprise. We sat around my small kitchen table. I brewed coffee and set out plates of muffins. No one spoke at first. Then Colin cleared his throat. "You look happy," he said quietly. I nodded. "I am." The conversation moved slowly. My father talked about the old neighborhood, about changes on their street, and how Mrs. Perkins still put up her Christmas lights the day after Halloween. Paige told a story about her new job at a marketing firm, her hands moving as she talked. My mother asked about my work, then listened as I explained what I did at the tech company. She nodded, sometimes with approval, sometimes with something like regret. Eric arrived later, carrying groceries. He greeted everyone with a gentle handshake and easy warmth. I introduced him as my friend, my partner. He chatted about local places to eat and the best hiking spots nearby. My mother watched him measuring. My father smiled, genuinely interested. That evening, I made dinner. Eric helped in the kitchen, Paige set the table, and Colin opened a bottle of wine. The meal was easy, filled with small talk, but the tension lingered underneath. When the plates were cleared, my mother pulled me aside. She looked at me closely. "You've changed," she said. "You seem stronger." I thanked her and didn't look away. After dinner, we sat together in the living room. My father started to speak, then stopped, searching for words. "I'm sorry, Lauren," he said, "for how things ended, for not doing more when you needed me." My mother looked away, jaw tight. Paige took my hand under the blanket and squeezed. I listened. The old ache was still there, but it didn't control me now. I told them about the years I'd spent alone, the friends who'd carried me through, and the life I'd built for myself piece by piece. I didn't spare them the details, but I didn't blame. My mother apologized in her way, careful, measured, but real. Paige cried. Colin said he'd never stop thinking about what might have been if he'd done things differently. We sat in the silence that followed. Rain pattered against the glass. For the first time, I felt a kind of peace, a sense that the story wasn't over, but I could finally turn the page. Later that night, as Eric and I cleaned the kitchen, he wrapped his arms around me. "You did it," he whispered. "You faced them." I rested my head on his shoulder. "I'm still here," I said, feeling it in my bones. The weekend passed in a gentle blur. We walked through Pike Place Market, tasted pastries, and watched ferries cross the bay. My family asked questions this time, listening to the answers. We talked about the future, Paige's new start, my parents' plans to travel, the possibility of visiting again. As they packed to leave, my father hugged me longer this time. My mother squeezed my hands and said, "Don't be a stranger." Paige promised to call. Colin lingered at the door. "You deserve this happiness, Laure. I hope you know that." When they drove away, the apartment felt quiet again, but it wasn't empty. Eric sat beside me on the couch, holding my hand. Outside, the sky brightened, and for the first time in years, I felt lightness return. The visit had changed something, not just in my family, but in myself. I had faced the past and survived it. Now a new chapter was waiting, one I could finally claim as my own. After my family left, the apartment felt bigger and quieter than before. Eric and I spent a few days moving back into our regular routines, but something lingered, a feeling that something unfinished had settled into the corners of each room. I went back to work, lost myself in code, and met up with Kim for coffee, but my mind kept drifting back to that long weekend. The apologies, the new honesty, the awkward goodbyes. For the first time, I wondered if a real future with my family was possible, not as it had been, but as something different. A week later, my father called again. His voice was tentative but hopeful. "We'd like to see you, Lauren. All of us together. There are things we didn't say last time." He suggested dinner at a restaurant in the city. I hesitated, remembering the strained silences of the past, but something inside me said yes. The restaurant was quiet, the kind with dark wood booths and soft music playing low in the background. Paige arrived first, hair pulled back and eyes tired but alert. My mother and Colin followed my father behind them. Eric came too, at my invitation, his steady presence a comfort at my side. We ordered dinner, made small talk, but soon enough the real reason for the gathering came out. My father set down his fork and looked around the table. "We owe you more than an apology, Lauren. I owe you an explanation." He spoke about the years after I left, how the house felt empty, how he'd come to realize all the ways he'd failed to stand up for me. My mother listened, face composed, but her hands twisted a napkin beneath the table. Paige watched them both, tears in her eyes. Colin cleared his throat. "When you left, I thought it would all blow over," he admitted. "But it didn't. Things just stopped. We missed you, Laure. We missed you more than we ever said." The words hung in the air. I listened, unsure what to say. Eric squeezed my hand under the table, his quiet support steadying me. My mother spoke next. She didn't cry, but her voice was soft. "I was wrong, Lauren. About so many things. About what mattered. About what I thought you should be." She reached for my hand, and for the first time I didn't pull away. Paige looked up. I let Mom's opinions get in the way. I followed along because it was easier than speaking up. I should have been your ally. Her voice broke. I'm sorry. The table was silent except for the clink of silverware and the soft sound of the pianist in the corner. I breathed in, let the words settle, then spoke. I told them what it felt like to leave, how hard it was to start over, and how grateful I was for the friends who became my family when I needed one most. We talked for hours. We didn't fix everything. There were memories we couldn't erase and wounds that still needed time to heal. But that night, something real began to mend a thread of connection, fragile but growing stronger with every honest word. After dinner, my father hugged me long and hard. Paige asked if we could go for coffee next week. My mother kissed my cheek quietly, promising to do better. Eric and I walked home through the city lights. He wrapped his arm around me, and I leaned into his warmth. There was no certainty about the future, but there was hope, and for the first time, I believed that was enough. The next morning, I called Kim and Dana to tell them what had happened. They listened, celebrated with me, and reminded me how far I'd come. At work, Ruth noticed the change in me. You seem lighter, she said. I smiled, feeling it for myself. As the days went on, I found myself reaching out to my family more. Paige and I met for coffee, sharing stories and laughter that had been missing for years. My mother sent recipes asking for updates about my life. My father called every Sunday just to hear my voice. Colin and I exchanged emails about books and old family memories. Through it all, Eric was by my side, gentle and patient. We made plans for the future, talked about traveling, maybe even starting a family of our own someday. One evening, as I looked around my apartment filled with laughter from friends and the steady presence of those I loved, I realized I was no longer just healing. I was thriving. The girl who had left home wounded and alone was gone. In her place stood a woman who had found her voice and her place in the world. The story wasn't over yet. There were still conversations to be had, bridges to repair, and new memories to build. But now the foundation was solid. I was no longer waiting for someone else to hand me happiness. I was choosing it every single day. As the city lights blinked outside my window, I felt ready for whatever would come next. It's strange how when true peace finally settles into your life, it rarely arrives with a grand announcement. For me, it came quietly. Just the steady comfort of mornings shared with Eric, calls from Paige that no longer carried the weight of old wounds, and the gentle sound of my father's laughter echoing over the phone. My mother kept her promises, reaching out in small, careful ways, and over time her messages softened. Colin visited sometimes, his stories from the old neighborhood, growing more nostalgic and less regretful. I found myself letting go of old resentments, not all at once, but bit by bit. The memories of what I lost and what was done to me never disappeared, but they lost their power to define my days. My work flourished, and so did my friendships. There were family dinners where laughter outlasted awkward pauses, and holidays where no one walked on eggshells. Paige and I grew close in a way we never managed, as kids sharing inside jokes and dreams for what might still be possible. One afternoon, as the rain tapped softly on the windows, my mother called just to ask how my day was. There was a time when I would have waited for the other shoe to drop, but now I answered with ease. Healing hadn't erased the past, but it gave me a future I could shape for myself. Eric and I made plans for a trip to the coast, just the two of us, and a promise not to talk about work. We spoke about starting a family, not out of a need to fix anything, but because our life together felt strong enough to carry new hopes. Looking back, I see now that justice for me wasn't about someone being punished or humiliated. It was about reclaiming my worth, building a life where my voice mattered, and my happiness wasn't something I needed anyone's permission for. The people who once broke my trust learned to see me as I am, and I learned to see them as imperfect, sometimes selfish, but capable of change. If there's one thing I'd want anyone listening to carry with them, it's this. No matter what's been taken from you or who tried to write your story for you, you always have the power to begin again. Sometimes justice looks like a courtroom, but sometimes it's as simple as finding your way back to yourself, surrounded by the people who finally learned to cherish you. Thank you for sharing this journey with me. If my story reminds you of your own, I hope you'll hold on to the truth that your life can change and that kindness to yourself and to others is never wasted. Feel free to share your thoughts or your story in the comments. Until next time, take gentle care of your heart.